Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 658, and today is August 16th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have a lot of news to get through on today's show, but first, need to mention the sponsor of the show, and that is the Expat Money Summit 2024, which is the world's largest offshore event taking place entirely online from October 7th through the 11th. It's hosted by Mikhail Thorup, the host of the Expat Money Show, which I have been on, and he is a highly sought after expat consultant with over 2 decades of experience. So if you get your ticket to the Expat Money Summit, you will discover why international diversification is a must for those looking to preserve their liberty and wealth. You will learn everything about crafting your perfect plan B, including how to quickly acquire a second passport, diversify your finances offshore, invest in international real estate, and get in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. Headline speakers include Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, and Tom Woods. And of course, if those headline speakers are enough for you, myself, Dave DeCamp, and Hervoya Morik will also be on one of the VIP panels for the event, discussing World War III, is it fear-mongering or a genuine concern? So if you want a complimentary ticket to the event, expatmoneysummit.com. Again, that's expatmoneysummit.com. If you want a VIP ticket to the event, you get it $100 off with the promo code Kyle. Whether you want the VIP ticket or the complimentary ticket, if you go to the show notes page, anywhere you can find the show, that's, YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, the Institute, AntiWarcom, anywhere you could listen to the audio podcast, you will find links that include links for my affiliate link if you just want the complimentary ticket. So click through from there. You'll let the Expat Money Summit know that you found them through this show. Or if you want to use the promo code, there's a link there that will take you and it automatically fills in the promo code and everything for you. So everything comes out right. Again, expatmoneysummit.com. And thanks to you all for listening. And then before we get into the news today, just want to remind people to follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. All right, big news here when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Biden considering sending long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine. So the Biden administration is open to sending Ukraine long-range air-to-surface cruise missiles amid Ukraine's offensive in Russia's Kursk Oblast, Politico reported on Thursday. The Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, JASSM, has a range of over 230 miles and would become the longest-range weapon the U.S. sends Ukraine if it goes ahead with the delivery. Sources told Politico that no final decision has been made, as the Pentagon is trying to figure out if the Soviet-era fighter jets could carry the powerful missile, which weighs 2,400 pounds and has a 1,000-pound warhead. Ukraine has also received a small number of U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets, which can carry the JASSMs, but it is unclear if the F-16 will be put to use since only a few Ukrainian pilots have trained on the platform. So the U.S. is supporting Ukraine's invasion of Kursk by allowing it to use U.S.-provided weapons, including armored vehicles. The U.S. says it is opposed to supporting long-range strikes in Russia, but it is unclear what the limit is. Ukraine is pushing for the U.S. to lift all restrictions on its use of U.S. weapons. The U.S. insists it is not aware of was not aware of Ukraine's plans to launch an invasion into Kursk, but President Biden said Tuesday that U.S. officials have been in constant contact with the Ukrainians about the assault. And as I mentioned on the show yesterday, while it is concerning that the Biden administration seemingly has either green light prior to or after at least the Ukrainian incursion into Russia here, it seems even more important that if the U.S. wasn't aware that Ukraine was going to do this at all in the first place, that's pretty shocking as well. One thing we should keep an eye on with these JASM missiles is that in the past, when the U.S. has considered sending longer range weapons to Ukraine, they typically do this first. They'll leak it to the press that they're considering it. And then a few weeks later, they will be leaning towards it. And then the next story we get is that the missiles are already in Ukraine. So it's very possible that, once again, the American people don't get a real debate over how much we are supporting this war and how close we're getting to World War III. All right, next up here. British Challenger 2 tanks being used by Ukrainian forces inside of Russia. So, this is from Dave DeCamp at AntiWarcom. Dave writes here, Ukrainian troops have been using British Challenger 2 tanks inside Russia as part of the offensive in the Kursk Oblast, Sky News reported on Thursday. And so here again, this would be really crazy, right? If the UK and the US were completely unaware of how Ukraine was positioning the advanced battle tanks that they had given the Ukrainians and just had no idea they were about to use these in a part of Russia. Don't you think that the UK and the US are very aware of where their tanks are being put inside of Ukrainian territory? And if the Ukrainians are about to launch an incursion into Russia, they would be at least somewhat aware of what their military platforms are going to be used for. So the report came the day after the UK Defense Ministry confirmed Ukraine was allowed to use British weapons inside the Russian mainland. Former British Defense Minister Ben Wallace said that he gave Ukraine permission to use British provided weapons inside Russia during his time in office. He said the only exception was for the Storm Shadow missile, which has a range of about 155 miles. The use of the British and other NATO-provided weapons inside Ukraine marks a significant escalation of the proxy war. Earlier this year, Moscow warned that Russian forces could target British military installations in response to British weapons being used in attacks on Russian territory. So any British missile facilities and equipment on the territory of Ukraine and beyond could be a response to the Ukrainian strikes with the use of British weapons on the territory of Russia, the Russian Foreign Ministry said in May. The U.S. is also allowing Ukraine to use its weapons in the Kursk offensive. President Biden gave Ukraine the green light to strike Russian territory with U.S. weapons at the end of May, following Russia's renewed assault in Kharkiv. The U.S. maintains that Ukraine cannot use U.S. weapons for long-range strikes, but hasn't defined any limits on what Ukraine can actually do. Ukraine's commander-in-chief claimed on Thursday that Ukrainian forces have penetrated 21 miles into Russian territory. Now, that does sound significant, and if you look at the map here, this is a significant incursion. This is not, as some people have tried to play this off, some minor Ukrainian offensive. At the same time, this is not a densely populated area of Russia. It's very sparsely populated. I think one helpful example was it was compared to the Missouri Ozarks as far as the number of people in the, kind of not necessarily densely forested, but definitely, a lot of wildlife in this terrain. And so it probably wasn't extremely difficult for Ukraine to capture a lot of this territory because it was sparsely defended by a few Russian border guards, not the Russian military. I'm not so sure if you look at this map here, if that the Russians would have really allowed the Ukrainians to take this much of Russian territory just to bait them into a trap. Now, there have been some reports that the Ukrainian soldiers operating in Ukraine are some of the most trained, well-equipped, and best soldiers that Ukraine has to offer. And so maybe if Russia was aware that the Ukrainians were preparing to use their best soldiers and redeploy them from the Donetsk, then maybe you could see some sort of military advantage to allowing this incursion to occur. But it does seem like this has to be a pretty negative moment for Vladimir Putin and the Russian rulers, right? To have this much of their territory invaded by Ukraine and not be able to repel that invasion within a few days. It's been well over a week, I think about 10 days at this point, that this Ukrainian offensive into Russia has been ongoing. So this is a extremely major development in this war and pushes us significantly closer to World War III. The only other point I wanted to make on this was there doesn't seem to be any real long-term gain here for the Ukrainians. Eventually, the Russians will expel the Ukrainians from their territory. They'll likely take some territory on the Ukrainian side of the border too to establish, more defensive fortifications to prevent the Ukrainians from pushing back into Russian territory. And ultimately, there may be some bombing of Ukrainian cities or something like that as punishment for this incursion into Russia. Also, just an interesting note here, it was seen that the Russians would have had some knowledge, at least, that the Ukrainians were about to do that. And the reports are, at least some people are suggesting that the Russians allowed the Ukrainians to do this. It would be awfully shocking if the Russians would have better intelligence on the planned Ukrainian offensive than the Americans, because the Americans claim to have no prior knowledge that this was going to occur. All right, next up here, Germany issues arrest warrant for Ukrainian over Nord Stream bombings. So, finally, some updates on the Nord Stream pipeline. German prosecutors have issued an arrest warrant for a Ukrainian man they believe to be involved in the sabotage of the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines, which connect Russia and Germany. The man, who was identified as a 44-year-old Ukrainian, is a professional diver that was last seen in Poland. But Polish prosecutors have said they suspect the man has already left the country, making it unclear if he will be arrested. The Nord Stream pipelines were bombed in September of 2022. At the time, many Western journalists and officials were quick to blame Russia, even though it didn't make sense for Moscow to bomb its own pipeline. In 2023, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published an article that alleged the pipelines were bombed under the direction of President Biden. According to Hersh's account, U.S. Navy divers planted the explosives on the pipeline during NATO exercises in the Baltic Sea in June of 2022, and then were detonated with a Norwegian spy plane a few months later. As the evidence that the U.S. had motive for the attack, Hersh's report pointed to threats from President Biden and former State Department official Victoria Nuland that the U.S. would take action against the Nord Stream if Russia invaded Ukraine. After the sabotage, Secretary of State Antony Blinkin called the destruction of the pipelines a tremendous opportunity for Europe to get off Russian gas. Hersh's report that the U.S. was behind the bombing has not been confirmed by other sources, and Western officials later began telling media outlets that Ukraine might have been responsible. The leading theory is that a small number of Ukrainians rented a sailboat in Poland from where they carried out the attack, which would have required a large amount of explosives. The Washington Post reported in November of 2023 that a jailed Ukrainian official coordinated the attack on the pipeline, and that he ultimately answered to General Volushny, Ukraine's former commander-in-chief. But that report has also not been confirmed, and the man who was jailed on an unrelated case denied involvement in the Nord Stream bombings. So we have a second report here. This one reports that Zelensky initially approved Nord Stream bombings. So a report by the Wall Street Journal on Thursday alleged that Ukrainian Prime Minister Zelensky initially approved the plan to bomb the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines. The report said Zelensky called off the plan after the CIA warned him not to do it, but General Volushny, who was Ukraine's commander-in-chief at the time, went ahead with the sabotage attack anyway. In response to a report that Germany issued an arrest warrant for a Ukrainian suspect of being involved in the Nord Stream bombings, Russia suggested Western countries were trying to shift the blame. So the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said the West's key task is to absolve itself of any responsibility for sabotaging the Nord Streams. Russia has previously blamed the U.S. and its NATO allies for the attack on the pipeline. Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a report last year that said Biden ordered the bombings and that U.S. Navy divers planted the explosives. So Hersh's report hasn't been confirmed by other sources, but since it was published, Western officials have been pinning the blame on Ukraine. And that was really interesting because before Hersh's report came out, the blame was placed on Russia. After Hirsch's report came out, the Western media started blaming it on Ukraine, which I think gives more credibility to the idea that this really was the Americans, and now they're trying to use their sources and, the people they control in the media, like the Wall Street Journal, to put out these stories and claim, again, like according to the Wall Street Journal report, the explosives were planted on the pipeline by a group of 6 Ukrainians who rented a small yacht in Germany. The report said the plot was thought up in May of 22 by a group of Ukrainian officials and businessmen during a night of drinking. Sources told the Journal that the sabotage team initially studied the plan to blow up Nord Stream that was drafted by Western officials and Ukrainian intelligence officials back in 2014, but was too costly and complex. The report, so again, it was too costly and complex for the U.S. to do, but somehow a group of 6 drunk Ukrainians who rented a sailboat were able to pull this off. The report said the German investigation of the attack is now focused on Zaluzhny, who is Ukraine's ambassador to the UK. An attack of this scale is sufficient reason to trigger the collective defense of the cause of NATO, but our critical infrastructure was blown up by a country that we support with massive weapons shipments and billions of cash, a German official said. A senior Russian diplomat in Berlin dismissed the German investigation, saying the findings were fairy tales worthy of the Brothers Grimm. In a response to the Journal report, an aide to Zelensky denied Ukraine was involved in the Nord Stream bombings and pointed the finger at Russia, which, again, doesn't make any sense. What made sense is that this was probably the Americans who did this bombing. All right, next up here is an article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. U.S. Israeli bombing Gaza will kill more civilians but not defeat Hamas. So, U.S. intelligence officials speaking with the New York Times said that Israel will not be able to defeat Hamas, and continuing to bomb Gaza will kill more civilians. Some national security officials expressed surprise at how much Israel has degraded Hamas over the 10-month onslaught, but acknowledged that Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, cannot pull out or cannot prevent the Palestinian group's reorganization. So according to the Times, Israel has achieved all it can militarily in Gaza, according to senior American officials who say the continued bombings are only a risk to civilians' lives. The report adds that several high-level officials traveling to the Middle East plan to tell Tel Aviv that there is little more they can accomplish against Hamas. The current and former national security official touted Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza as surprisingly effective in degrading Hamas. However, the officials admit that the IDF has been unable to destroy the tunnel network under Gaza or keep Hamas from reestablishing itself after Israeli forces withdrawal. So the Times report says Hamas's tunnel network has provided a much larger than Israel anticipated and remains an effective way for Hamas to hide its leaders and move fighters around. And even as the Israeli Defense Forces have seized territory and killed Hamas fighters from north to south in the territory, they have to repeatedly go back in as Hamas fighters regrouped. The American officials additionally said that military operations have failed to achieve the primary goal of returning over 100 Israeli hostages who are still captives of Hamas in the besieged enclave. Washington is pushing Tel Aviv to negotiate a hostage deal with Hamas to free the captives, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has refused any agreement that would see Israel pause its operations in the Strip. The Times report notes that the White House has pushed the IDF to use 250-pound bombs in Gaza. The U.S. has shipped Israel thousands of the munitions since October 7th, and the bombs have been used in several massacres, including a strike on a school serving as a shelter in Gaza that killed over 100 people last week. So just, really disturbing that we're pushing them to use 100-pound bombs. Another thing that was mentioned in the article, and I don't think this is a big deal because it's not a very firm number, but it says that Israel estimates that 14,000 Hamas fighters have been killed or captured in their operations. And it says that the U.S.'s number is more conservative than that, but it doesn't actually give a number. But it's the U.S. number is less than 14,000. I think that's something that we also learned from this article that's worth mentioning. All right. We passed a grim milestone yesterday in Gaza. The official count of those killed is now over 40,000. So Gaza's health ministry said Thursday that the number of Palestinians it has recorded killed by the Israeli onslaught has surpassed 40,000, or about 2% of the population. The number is considered a conservative estimate, says it doesn't account for the 10,000 people who are missing and believed to be dead under the rubble. The health ministry said that a total of 40,005 Palestinians have been killed over 10 months, including 40 that were killed by Israeli forces in the previous 24 hours. They also said that a total of 92,401 Palestinians have been wounded. The health ministry has identified 32,280 bodies by name, which includes 10,627 children, 5,956 women, and 2,770 elderly people. Gaza's media office has estimated more than 16,000 children have been killed by the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. It's unclear how many Palestinians have died due to indirect causes of the siege, such as food shortages, medical shortages, and the destruction of Gaza's health facilities and the spread of disease. Gaza's media office has said that at least 35 children have starved to death so far. A letter written by a group of experts recently published by the British medical journal The Lancet estimated that the total number of deaths in Gaza, including those killed by the Israeli military and indirect causes, could reach 186,000. That estimate used the death toll from the end of June, which was 37,396. A group of American doctors and nurses who volunteered in Gaza wrote a letter to President Biden last month saying they estimated the actual death toll already exceeded 92,000, or 4.2% of the population. The American medical professionals also detailed the horrific violence being committed by Israeli soldiers against the children. So the letter said, every single signatory of this letter, which was dozens, I think over 40, treated children in Gaza who suffered violence that must have been deliberately directed at them. Specifically, every one of us on a daily basis treated preteen children who were shot in the head. The U.S. continues to support the genocidal war despite a massive civilian and child death toll. This week, the Biden administration showed its strong support for backing the slaughter by approving $20 billion in weapon sales for Israel, including F-16 fighter jets, which will take years to arrive, but also tank ammunition, which could be there immediately. All right, next up here, this one, Dave DeCamp, August 15th, AntiWar.com. AntiWar.com joins journalists in letter to Blinkin calling for U.S. to end military aid to Ukraine. So Dave writes, AntiWar.com has joined 19 other news outlets, several press freedom organizations, and 120 journalists in a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinkin calling for the U.S. to end weapons transfers to Israel and to stop supporting the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. The letter was initiated by the Courage Foundation, Defending Rights and Dissident, and Roots Action, and is focused on the Israeli targeting of journalists in Gaza. So the letter reads, since October 7th, 2023, Israel has killed more than 160 Palestinian journalists. This is the largest recorded number of journalists killed in any war. While Israel's indiscriminate bombing of the densely populated Gaza means no civilians are safe, Israel has repeatedly documented deliberately targeting journalists. The letter notes that the mass killing in Gaza would not be possible without U.S. weapons and support. It says, Israel's military actions are not possible without U.S. weapons, U.S. military aid, and U.S. diplomatic support. By providing the weapons being used to deliberately kill journalists, you are complicit in one of the gravest affronts to press freedom today. So besides targeting journalists with bombs, the Israeli government has also cracked down on the press by shuttering Al Jazeera in Israel. So the letter says, Israel has gone to great lengths to suppress the media coverage of its war in Gaza, imposing military censorship on both its own journalists and international reporters operating in the country, and with Egypt's help, blocking all foreign journalists from Gaza. Israel shut down Al Jazeera, raided its offices, seized its equipment, and blocked its broadcast and website within Israel. The letter points to U.S. foreign assistance laws that prohibit military aid to countries credibly accused of human rights violations. Israel's well-documented pattern of extrajudicial executions of journalists is a gross violation of human rights, the letter concludes. And it also adds that the U.S. is providing the weapons Israel continuously uses to target Palestinian journalists in Gaza. This is a violation of international law and, more importantly, U.S. domestic law. We urge you to immediately cease transfers of all weapons to Israel. So Blinkin and other U.S. officials claim they are concerned about the massive civilian death toll in Gaza, but continue to arm Israel. Earlier this week, Blinken's State Department approved a series of arms deals for Israel worth $20 billion, which came hours after the Israeli strike in Gaza killed newborn twins. All right, let's move on and talk about Lebanon here for just a moment. Support for war in Lebanon grows among Israeli officials. So this one, Dave DeCamp, April 14th, AntiWarcom. Dave writes, there is a growing support among Israeli officials to launch an offensive in Lebanon against Hezbollah, the Wall Street Journal reported on Wednesday. The report comes as Israel is anticipating a major response from Hezbollah to the assassination of Farouk Shakur, a high-level Hezbollah military commander who was killed by an Israeli airstrike in Beirut on July 30th. While the Israeli military and Hezbollah have continued to trade fire across the Israel-Lebanon border since Shakur's killing, Hezbollah has not escalated things beyond rocket and drone attacks, similar to the ones it's been launching since October of 2023. Current and former Israeli officials told the Journal that escalations from Hezbollah could be a major pretext for Israel to launch a full-blown war in Lebanon. One senior Israeli official said a major Hezbollah attack could lead to an Israeli attack that will lead to a new reality on the northern border. Some members of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government want a ceasefire in Gaza, which could cool tensions in the north, while others see an offensive as an opportunity to launch an offensive in Lebanon. Israeli officials told the Journal that the leadership of Israel's Northern Command is also itching for an escalation against Hezbollah. One reason Israeli officials think the time is right for escalation is the strong support that the U.S. has shown Israel in the wake of the assassination of the Hamas leader and the Israeli assassination of Hamas's political chief, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran, which is expected to provoke a major Iranian reprisal attack. The U.S. insists it is doing everything it can to prevent a war in Lebanon elsewhere in the region, but providing unconditional military support for Israel has only emboldened the Israelis. The U.S. is also vowing to defend Israel from any consequences for the recent assassinations and has deployed more firepower to the region to secure that end. So on Tuesday, the State Department approved a $20 billion weapons sale to Israel, which I'm sure is a signal to the Israelis that, hey, the U.S. does have your back if you go to war with Iran, Hezbollah, or whoever else. So I did think we would see the response from Iran to come this week. There's a couple reasons it could potentially be held up. I think one of those reasons is that Iran is trying to secure a ceasefire deal, and they think that if they could turn the Israeli assassination of Haniyeh into diplomatic leverage and they force Israel into a deal, then that in a way would show Iran's power in the region without conducting an attack in Israel that is likely to provoke a major Israeli response. So my guess is that's the Iranian thinking. Also, I guess Iran probably isn't in a major hurry to carry out a retaliation, just because the longer Israel maybe has some military assets redeployed or something like that, the better things will be for the people of Gaza. So, Pentagon, 8 troops wounded in Syria attack last week. This one, Dave DeCamp, August 13th, AntiWar.com. The Pentagon said Tuesday that a total of 8 U.S. troops were wounded in a drone attack that hit a U.S. base in northeastern Syria on Friday. Pentagon spokesperson Brigadier General Pat Ryder said all 8 troops were treated for smoke inhalation and traumatic brain injuries. 3 of those service members have returned to duty while others remain under observation. According to CENTCOM, none of the injuries are life-threatening, and that's what Ryder told reporters. U.S. officials first said Saturday that U.S. service members were wounded in a one-way drone attack but didn't specify how many. The attack came the same week that 4 U.S. troops and 1 American contractor were wounded when rockets hit the Al-Assad air base in western Iraq. Iraqi Shia militias launched over 100 drone attacks on U.S. bases from October 2023 to February of this year in response for the U.S. support for Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. But after 3 U.S. troops were killed in January at Tower 22, a secretive U.S. base in Jordan, Iran and the Iraqi government pressured the militias to stop the attacks. In recent weeks, attacks restarted, potentially because the U.S. has not made any clear moves towards withdrawing from Iraq, despite Washington and Baghdad starting talks on the future of the U.S. military presence. Tensions are also soaring in the region as Iran is expected to launch a reprisal attack on Israel for the assassination of Hamas's political chief in Tehran. Harrison Mann, a former U.S. Army major who resigned from the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency in May due to U.S. support for the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, said in an op-ed published by The Guardian on Tuesday that U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria were not being protected. Mann said in his op-ed that he and his colleagues at the Pentagon were saddened but not surprised when 3 U.S. troops were killed at Tower 22. As the close calls and injuries mounted, we came to the stunning realization that there was no plan to protect U.S. troops beyond leaving them in their small, isolated bases, while local militias, emboldened and agitated by the U.S. support for Israel's brutal war in Gaza, used them for target practice. We also have Iran saying that an IRGC officer dies of wounds sustained in a U.S.-led strike in Syria. I had thought that this guy had actually died when the strike happened. It was sometime between July 22nd and August 5th, so it was right around when Shakur and Hania were killed by the Israelis. And so this, it isn't as meaningful as an assassination as the other two, but is probably, adds to the Iranian need to respond and may increase the response they ultimately issue. All right, last article here for the week. This one I wrote for the Institute on August 13th. U.S. South Korea preparing to begin provocative war games. So the U.S. and South Korea are preparing to kick off large-scale war games later this month. The summertime joint military drills are viewed by Pyongyang as an annual rehearsal for invading North Korea. The war games are set to begin on July 19th and run through the end of the month. At least 19,000 Korean soldiers will participate. The Pentagon has not released the number of American troops that will be involved. The drills will include computer simulations and live fire operations. So Ryan Donald, the spokesman of U.S. forces in Korea, said when describing the drills, this exercise will reflect the realistic threats across all domains such as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's, that's North Korea's, missile threats, and we will take in lessons learned from recent armed conflicts. ROK and U.S. units will execute combined field training exercises across all domains. Field maneuvers and live fire exercises will strengthen the alliance's interoperability while showcasing our combined capabilities and resolve. So the military drills and other large-scale U.S. and South Korean war games typically result in North Korea test firing missiles or conducting reciprocal war games. Tensions on the Korean Peninsula have heightened under President Joe Biden. Over the past 3.5 years, the U.S. has conducted more live-fire war games, deployed nuclear-capable military assets to the region, and increased trilateral security cooperation between Tokyo, Washington, and Seoul. North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un has reacted sharply to Biden's militarism. Compared to the diplomacy offered by Donald Trump, Pyongyang has executed several missile tests and drills in response to Washington and Seoul's aggressive military posture. Adding to the tensions, Washington and Pyongyang is North Korea's developing relationship with Russia. After the Kremlin ordered the invasion of Ukraine, the White House attempted to isolate Russia from the rest of the world. However, Moscow found several Asian partners, including North Korea, China, and Iran. And so that's kind of just the widespread U.S. sanctions campaign blowing up in our own face as all these countries that are supposed to be isolated and sanctioned now just trade with each other. All right, everybody, thank you so much for listening to the show this week. I really appreciate it. We'll be back with more shows next week.